Well, I'm very excited to be here today. I'm very excited that the initial indication that my flight was totally canceled and that I had no chance of getting to Nashville for today was wrong, particularly because many months ago, it seems now, when the snowbanks were piled high by my back window, I received a call with today's date as the one to mark on my calendar. And it was not only to be here to talk about this study that we conducted, but it was that there was this conference, and that this report would be commissioned for this conference, and that all research and deliverables had to be targeted towards delivery for this conference. So to miss this conference would have indeed been a major disappointment. So I am very happy to be here to talk to you about the Tennessee Clean Energy Assessment that my firm conducted specifically for this conference. So there are lots of different ways to study jobs. There's lots of different ways to study economic impacts. And we'll get into that a little bit about how we went about doing this. But really the first issue that we had to address is to answer this seemingly very simple question. What is clean energy? So clean is not a terribly descriptive word in the world of research because for obvious reasons it does not kind of specify a particular technological area. It doesn't specify a segment of the value chain. It doesn't really tell us very much, and it's actually quite subjective. It's probably an upgrade from the term we used to use, which was green, which was even broader and meant even less, right? So from a research perspective, when we started doing this work about 9 or 10 years ago, and everything was about green jobs, we had the distinct pleasure of trying to figure out how you translate a color into a defensible research methodology. So it was very important for us to kind of take some time to think about what clean energy is, how other states have looked at clean energy, how the U.S. government looks at clean energy, and kind of trying to marry an understanding of the popular perception among people who would read the report and what they think clean energy is, but also having a lens so that we can be very credible and defensible in terms of what's in and what's out. So that's the first major component. And if I start going way down too far in a boring methodological road, just throw something at me. But basically, for the purposes of this study, there are 4 primary categories that we study, and the largest are the first 2. And I just want to take a second here on this slide to talk about how we come to these categories. So the first thing that's very important to recognize for this study's methodology is that to be included as a clean energy company, your firm has to be directly involved with one of the following major technologies. So what does that mean? That means that some segment of your firm's primary activity needs to be connected to renewable energy, energy efficiency, alternative transportation, or greenhouse gas management and accounting. So if you are a warehouse, and in your warehouse you distribute computer products, and you have solar panels on your roof, you are not a renewable energy company. If that same warehouse has an energy efficiency program where there's a coordinator who goes in and makes sure all the lights are shut off and makes sure that all the equipment is tuned up, you are not a clean energy company, okay? So this is done in an attempt to say we are counting the firms and the organizations that are directly connected as part of their business, as part of their business operations to one of these 4 areas. So what do we include under these? Renewable energy. Generally, the 3 largest that we typically see are going to be solar, wind, and hydro, although geothermal is clearly included in there. Some biomass is included in there. Depending on where you are in the country, you might have wave energy. Everything after that ends up being quite small, typically. Energy efficiency, this is an important and actually quite difficult to capture segment. energy efficiency, what we count here again are those firms that are directly involved with some segment of the value chain for energy efficiency goods and services. Some studies that you will see, they're very narrow, and they only capture energy efficiency that goes, say, beyond code. Right? There's a study out that recently came out in California that said there's 30,000 energy efficiency jobs in California, because what they're measuring is only those jobs that are connected to improvements beyond code. Now, the people in California, a lot of them don't like that, right? Because they're saying 30,000 energy efficiency jobs. We are unfairly compared to other states because our building codes are so far beyond everybody else's that you're not counting huge segments of what's counted here. So we didn't do that here in Tennessee because we want to be able to compare these numbers to other states. And we think that if you're going to count somebody putting a 31 SEER heat pump ductless mini split into a house in Tennessee, then somebody doing that in Massachusetts, California, Georgia, Ohio, Florida, it should all count the same. So that's how we deal with efficiency. There are some interesting questions in that, right? So is all insulation included? Yes, it's an energy efficient product, right? So all insulation is included. Alternative transportation, generally what this means is electric cars, maybe hybrid electric vehicles. For public transportation, it includes only the fleet mechanics who work on alternative fuel buses, for example, or electric rail. So we don't count bus drivers. That's one of the key questions we get all the time. Do you count the bus drivers? We learned from BLS and Brookings that that's not a question we want to have to say yes to. And then finally, greenhouse gas management and accounting, which is very small. This includes things like carbon sequestration, which is very small. It also includes things more on the accounting side. So some of the energy auditing can go in there, calculating carbon footprints, et cetera, would go in that category. Again, fairly small around the country. So these are the categories that we've used in multiple other states, and we'll get into that, but that's what we're dealing with here in Tennessee. Now, a lot of people ask us, okay, are you talking about direct, indirect, or induced jobs, right? And these are economic terms. You'll probably hear more about those in the next panel. What we are looking at, we don't do an economic model, so what we're looking at is saying, how do we capture the direct impact, the direct job impacts of the industry by putting our arms around the full value chain of activities. So we start at R&D, and we work all of our way up into installation and maintenance and professional services. Now, there are segments of the value chain that we can't capture with this methodology, subcomponent manufacturing, materials that are not part of that if it's kind of far removed from the direct product. So that is something that could be encapsulated with a module. But basically, again, we developed this methodology to be fairly conservative and make sure that we can defend the actual clean energy nature of these companies and jobs. So once we have the idea of what's in and what's out, we develop a methodology for collecting that information so that we can get an understanding of what's happening. So our approach is an employer survey that essentially serves as an overlay over existing Bureau of Labor Statistics data. So if any of you have looked at Bureau of Labor Statistics data or played with Bureau of Labor Statistics data or attempted to use BLS data to answer questions about clean energy, you find out very quickly that the codes that they have and the way that they categorize things work very well for the traditional economy, but really don't give us a lot of answers for clean energy. So we can't rely on BLS data. However, there's a lot of it. Right? There's a lot of BLS data, and the categories are almost useful. Right? So several years ago, the Bureau of Labor Statistics did what's called a supplemental series. You may have seen it. It was the Green Goods and Services Survey. And what they attempted to do is kind of shade in traditional industry sectors, kind of how green they are. And this is somewhat similar. So we use our employer survey built off of labor statistics, BLS data, so that we can determine how much of the traditional economy has shifted or is shifting to clean energy activities. So as an example, how much of the electrical contractor industry in Tennessee is doing something connected to clean energy? And then of those who are doing something connected to clean energy, what percentage of their work is actually clean energy versus non-clean energy product? So that's how we go about the very basics of using the employer survey and the BLS data. We do develop a known universe. In Tennessee, we didn't develop a huge known universe. That is basically those pure play firms, particularly that are maybe 100% engaged in one specific technology, where they would be seen as kind of an outlier in a random sample. But most of the data comes from a random sampling of firms within each of those traditional industry codes that have something to do with energy. Okay? And the electrical contractor example is one of those. So yes, we basically determine, looking at the geography of where these firms are distributed throughout the state, looking at the size, are they micro businesses, are they large businesses? We develop a sample that represents that, and then we make lots and lots and lots of phone calls. So if there are any employers in the room, I hope we didn't bother you too much. So this actually went in the field just a couple of months ago. And so the data are very current. We actually did place nearly 17,000 phone calls, so a fairly extensive effort. And we received over 1,000 responses to the survey, which again, response rates, it's a bit of a challenge because we are targeting lots of different companies, and a lot of those companies say, no, we don't do anything clean energy related, right? So 1,000 responses, and that generates a margin of error of just under 3% at a 95% confidence interval for those of you who are interested in statistics. So I guess the point of this slide is to say we spent a lot of time calling businesses. So we have used this methodology in multiple states. We're going to look at some of those states now. Actually, this is, today we release Tennessee's number 10, Ohio, which is released this afternoon, is number 11, and Rhode Island will be released in 2 weeks, which will be number 12. We actually, thanks to Senator Bernie Sanders, who used some of our data on solar jobs on the floor of the Senate and caused a big stir, the Congressional Research Office was employed to actually see if he was telling the truth, and they said yes. They said, actually, look at this, and it's the most credible. So we were very excited to get that free bit of press. We didn't have to pay for it, the endorsement or anything. But yes, the Congressional Research Office said that we had the most credible methodology for calculating solar jobs. We were very excited about that. They are the official statistics in 3 states, so we are hired by the energy offices of 3 states. And in fact, one of those states, Massachusetts, we're in our 5th year of employing the same methodology. And as I mentioned, U.S. Senator and President Obama actually has cited our findings as well. So we feel like we've built a fairly credible model for comparison's sake. And now that I've spent a lot of time talking about what we did, let's talk about what we found. So the first finding here is that Tennessee has a substantial clean energy industry, using the definition that we laid out. There are actually 2,611 clean energy businesses, and that's again defined as a company somewhere in the value chain in Tennessee that spends some portion of their time directly supporting clean energy activities. So that could include everything from the R&D facility that's working on next generation hydro technology to that HVAC contractor that is installing heat pump mini splits. 44,269 workers spend some portion of their time supporting that segment of the business. Okay? So what we do first is we say, how many businesses are there that are doing something connected to clean energy? How many people work at those businesses? And then of that big number, how many spend some portion of their time supporting clean energy? Okay? So if you work at a company that has 4 product lines, and we can use Nissan, right, as a good example. If you work on the Ultima line, you don't count. If you work on the Leaf line, you count. Does that make sense? So that's how we come up with that 44,269 workers. That's a pretty big number for a state the size of Tennessee, and it actually is 1.6% of the state's labor market. Okay, so of all jobs in Tennessee, it's 1.6%. That's what that number represents. I'm going to talk in a little bit about how that compares to other states, but it's pretty close to average across the states that we've studied. So you can see, obviously, California leads the country, although actually is not the #1 in terms of percent of total jobs. That distinction goes to Vermont, which benefits from the fact that I think there are more people in this room than live in the state of Vermont. So what you see here is most states, unless you kind of see one of the big market leaders, Vermont's a bit of an outlier, but really Massachusetts and California are kind of way ahead. And then most of the other states that we studied have been right in this range. So I would say that Tennessee at 1.6 is just slightly more than Ohio and Missouri, more than Iowa, just a hair less than Florida and Illinois. The other thing I wanted to point out on this slide is kind of the past growth. What you see here is that Tennessee, the 6.3% growth, and we're going to look at that in a little bit, is pretty good growth, right? That's a healthy number. That far exceeds kind of overall state job growth. This includes the growth figure here. We're not talking about net jobs. We're not talking about any other impacts or job losses from other sectors, or even just purely new hires. What we're talking about here is the difference between how many clean energy jobs there were a year ago and how many clean energy jobs there are today. So if you work at Nissan and they say, okay, you used to work on Altimas and now we're going to upskill you and you're going to work on how to put together a Nissan Leaf or work in the battery plant, you would move into this category as a clean energy job because you've been reclassified. The other thing I would note here, though, is of the states studied, Tennessee had a fairly low kind of future growth rate and projection. And this is not our prediction. This is not a forecast. This is what businesses expect to see their growth to be over the next 12 months. Okay? So this is not developed by me. This is not developed by kind of an economic model. This is not taking into account any assumptions other than those assumptions that employers have themselves. Okay? So this is their projection. And what you see there is it's a bit lower, and we can talk a little bit about why when we get into the makeup of the industry here. So here again is that slide. You see is fairly strong growth given current economic conditions. If the actual projections do come true at 5.7%, that would be several thousand jobs. There you see, obviously some optimism greater than the projections for the overall economy. And now we get into kind of what people are doing, what these businesses and workers are doing throughout the value chain. So installation and generation makes up more than or just about half of all jobs. Actually, that's fairly low. Normally, you see well over half are focused in installation. And the reason why is really because of the strength of manufacturing here in Tennessee. There is a lot of manufacturing in Tennessee that exists, and there's some great things about that, and there's some kind of storm clouds that we worry about manufacturing. It's kind of an interesting issue to look at, but clearly what you see here is a huge chunk of this is between installation, generation, and manufacturing. And when you look at growth, what you see here is the lowest percentage of projected growth by employers does come from those manufacturers, which makes sense, right? So that does make sense to us. We do expect to see that. But when you have a large segment that's growing more slowly, you see that is one of the drags on growth. Now, it did grow by quite a bit over the last year, almost 10%. And we find about 1,250 new jobs in manufacturing. And that is actually, again, both new jobs, new production, as well as moving more of the product lines towards clean energy goods and services, or goods in this case. Professional services, installation, generation expected to grow the fastest over the next 12 months. That was an interesting finding for us. We did look at some of the reasons why, and we're going to get into that. We asked employers about what's driving their growth. But what you see here is that most of the jobs that are being created in the state are at the production or technician level. So what we want to kind of figure out here is, all right, how many of these folks of these new hires are engaged in these different segments of the workforce. And what we find actually is that a strong majority of these are actually are in production or a technician level, meaning that they're either the technician is actually installing or repairing or maintaining the system, or they're on that assembly line. So what are some of the big drivers of manufacturing here in Tennessee? You know, the interesting thing is normally when we look at a state's clean energy economy, generally what we see is a lot of small businesses doing a little bit of work in clean energy. Right? So you get a lot of electrical contractors installing LED bulbs, and that makes the big chunk of what's happening in the state's clean energy economy. But here in Tennessee, what we found were these really large employers that are producing lots of goods for a global economy. Obviously, you have the Nissan Leaf facility and its associated lithium-ion battery plant and the activity that goes on around it, supporting it. That's a big area. Tennessee also is home to several large appliance manufacturers and building controls as well that are producing Energy Star appliances, again, for the global marketplace. So you know, you can easily see who those are. You look at some of the names that are out there. But more and more, these appliances that are being produced are Energy Star compliant, which is increasing that activity in the state. We have the Sharp LED plant in Memphis, and then the carbon fiber research facility that's creating a lot of activity as well. So really what you see is there's a broad base of clean energy manufacturing. You know, and people often like to focus on one or two stories about where it's strong, where it's not strong. Here what we see is, you know, clearly transportation, the appliances, and the building materials are three areas where we're seeing lots of reported activity in state. So just about anywhere, in fact, in all 12 states that we've studied, energy efficiency is always the biggest in terms of jobs and businesses. In fact, in states where we've looked at patent activity, where we've looked at investments, where we've looked at other metrics outside of jobs, we find the same to be true. Energy efficiency is generally the biggest segment of the clean energy economy. And it is here in Tennessee too, although it is much smaller than expected, particularly since all of those building control manufacturing activities and Energy Star appliances fall under the energy efficiency category. So here it's about 46.7% of all jobs. You can see the different technologies and how it breaks down. Take a moment to look at that. And this perhaps is one of the reasons why there's an opportunity here in Tennessee. Tennessee ranked 38th. I don't know if that... Maybe somebody intentionally did that to make it a little hard to read, that 38th. Tennessee ranked 38th nationwide on the ACEEE National Energy Efficiency Scorecard. So if those of you are not familiar with that, it's basically a state scorecard that looks at all the different policies, incentives, state-level drivers that look at energy efficiency in a state. And obviously 38th is, you know, number 1 is the best, number 50 is the worst. So you can see 38th is not great. It means there's a lot of room for improvement. And what we have found in our research is that particularly in the deployment segment, you know, installation and maintenance, which is usually the largest value chain segment, the energy efficiency numbers there do kind of strongly correlate to the ranking. Okay, so what does this actually mean for Tennessee? So we talk about these energy efficiency leaders. You know, in California, for example, there's about 300,000 energy efficiency jobs. So we do think that policies that were more reflective of you know, a higher ranking, right? If you could get up to about 25, right, the top half, we do think that can very easily translate into job potential in, you know, in the 5 figures, right? So more than 10,000 jobs in Tennessee. So significantly smaller percentage when compared to other states. So here are just a few examples where you can see most states, it's anywhere from 2/3 to 8 to 10 jobs connected to energy efficiency. And again, with Tennessee's strength in other segments of the value chain that most states don't have, we see this as a particularly strong opportunity. Now this is an interesting slide because this slide is looking at the firm breakdown, not the employment breakdown. Okay, so don't try to calculate 70% and then apply that to the renewable energy number and think that's what we're looking at for solar. What you could probably imagine is that when you look at something like hydropower, that's going to have a lot more employees per establishment than a small residential solar contract. Right? So what we're looking at here is of the renewable energy firms that are out there, this was the breakdown of what they do. And obviously, some firms are doing more than one activity, which is why this adds up to more than 100%. But the point here is that there are a significant number of companies that are dipping their toes into the solar industry. Okay? And that is typically in the electrical contractor space. There are some other construction trades that are getting involved in that. They're increasingly interested in that. What we see in states that have really invested heavily in solar incentives for consumers, we have seen a bit of consolidation. So we see some of the big national players moving in and setting up huge facilities and really taking a big chunk of that market share. Again, an example, Massachusetts, which I know because I just was dealing with this, Solar City moved in a few years ago and now has about 800 employees in the state from I think 4 years ago. So again, third-party financing and all those kinds of things that drive the industry, what you end up seeing is some consolidation. So that's just an interesting point in that here in Tennessee, we're still seeing a lot of smaller firms getting engaged in those solar technologies. So this is probably not surprising that electric vehicles are driving the bus here. That's probably a bad pun. I guess I did that on purpose. Electric vehicles drive Tennessee's alternative transportation sector. Again, this is pretty clearly a result of the large manufacturing facility here producing the electric vehicles. Although it is interesting to note that as the percentage of penetration of hybrid electric and electric vehicles increases in the state, there's more and more repair shops that have to find people who are trained and certified to work on those vehicles. So you cannot take a run-of-the-mill mechanic and have them work on an electric vehicle or even a hybrid electric vehicle. In most states, that is actually not even legal to do because there are huge issues with safety. A big zap. So again, 88% of firms in alternative transportation work with electric vehicles and systems. 6.3% work with electric rail. So again, this could be anything from working on innovations, the next generation electric rail. This could be developing components for electric rail outside. This could be repair and maintenance or professional services. And then the other businesses, so this has a lot to do with the hybrid electric vehicles, particularly the servicing of those vehicles as well. But none of those in that category are big enough to break out. So just a few more points. I wanted to drive home this point about manufacturing. So we talked a lot about manufacturing already, but this is substantially bigger in Tennessee than any other state that we've studied. And I just threw a couple of states that are fairly close where we studied to show you just how different the manufacturing sectors are in those states. Ohio, which is being released later today, is actually obviously a slightly higher number than the three that we have here. But you can see almost 30% of those jobs connected to exports. So speaking of exports, right, since you have this strength here in Tennessee, how do we build on that strength? One, I don't want to say easy way, but one way that we would suggest doing that is to really support the local supply chain. So what we found here for export companies, about 2/3 are getting their vendors and suppliers are located locally. We would like to see that increase if you want to capture more of the economic activity. So that is a little bit lower than what we see in some other states. And with a oversized manufacturing sector, capturing more of the supply chain locally will create more positive economic benefits for the state. So that was one that kind of jumped out at us. And then we asked firms about what their drivers were and what they wanted to see to stimulate the economy. And so there's a couple of points here that are interesting. So financial incentives tops the list here in Tennessee and in states where there is what we would consider to be significant room for improvement vis-a-vis other states. Right? So this is the top-of-mind issue for employers engaged in clean energy here in Tennessee. They're very interested in these financial incentives, particularly rebates and tax credits. What we start to see in states where there are already or stronger financial incentives, we see this and the financing mechanisms start to switch. Okay? So in places that already have strong incentives, we start seeing more of a call for financing mechanisms to either go with those or in recognition of some sort of phase out, right, that they want to see. How do we make this easier for consumers? So one approach, obviously, is to subsidize it, right, through tax credits and rebates, which works very well in some states. The other way is to say, look, we're not going to make it actually any cheaper. We're just going to make it so that you don't have to pay for it all up front. Particularly for renewable energy systems, this resonates a lot with consumers as well. Particularly when you tell them, remind them that when there's a new power plant that needs to be built, they don't have to make an upfront payment in order to be able to buy power from it. They subsidize that over time through their rates. So similar types of mechanisms for renewable make a lot of sense for consumers and generally are willing to do it. And so we would expect over time to see that number creep up. So some conclusions before we have some questions and answers, hopefully some answers, hopefully some questions. Clean energy employers are adding jobs at a rate that is faster than the overall economy. And a lot of that is driven by production for the global marketplace. Okay, so Tennessee is producing for the entire world, particularly in the areas that I mentioned here, electric cars and energy efficient materials, but even some of your energy is transported, and these advanced building controls, which is a growing segment here in Tennessee. However, despite this kind of, the large size and the growth that we've seen, there is a lot of room for growth in state, a lot of room, and there are three areas that we suggest doing that. The first really is the deployment segment, and it appears from our research that the energy efficiency deployment segment is the low-hanging fruit here. And so the three things that we think can encourage small businesses to engage in this cluster and start doing more of this work, and encourage consumers to do more of this work, that would be similar to other states that we've looked at. First and foremost, consumer incentives, so increasing and supporting additional consumer incentives to make it easier and less expensive and reduce the upfront costs for consumers to install energy efficiency upgrades. The second is marketing. So the most successful programs do market, right? Because most people who are going to do something to their home or business building that they own are going to call the contractor they've worked with before. And most of them are going to say, my boiler broke, or I'm getting killed on my electric bill, or how can I save money here? Or I'm not sure how much longer I have for this system. They don't necessarily know a whole lot about what's out there. They don't know about any incentives that exist, and they may not know about the new technologies. So the second bullet here is about marketing directly to consumers about the incentives that you're going to adopt and the technologies themselves. And then the third, highly related to that, is contractor training. So in the first study that we did looking at energy efficiency was in Southern California, San Diego County, right? People think of California as being way out ahead of everybody else. 89% of contractors, this was in 2007, 89% of contractors could not name a single program to make, for consumers, to make it less expensive for them to upgrade their home with a clean energy product. So when you can't name a single one as a contractor, you're probably not telling your customers about it. So when somebody calls and says, I'm not sure how much time I have in my water heater, they'd say, yep, looks bad, $250 for a new electric water heater, and that's it. End of conversation, write the check and you're done. They don't talk about the new technologies that are out there if they don't know about the incentives and they don't know about the technologies. So contractor training is hugely important. Second is support local vendors and suppliers. There's lots of ways to do that. I'm not going to go into the deep conversations that economic developers have over this, but just as an awareness from the research that there is opportunity to capture more of the local supply chain. And then third is build on those existing strengths. So, there's an electric vehicle market here and a cluster of activity that's happening that really is the envy of many places that would like to be leaders in clean energy, right? So working to build on that would be great. Energy efficiency products, again, there's this hotbed of activity, particularly on the production side for building materials and appliances, leveraging that and working with those employers to find out what their specific needs are and how you can capture more activity in Tennessee would be a valuable exercise. And then renewable energy generation. Obviously, there's multiple technologies employed here in state for renewable energy. And so opportunities to build on those existing strengths with renewable energy gen. The percentage of renewable energy generation here is quite high, obviously because of hydro, but working with next generation lower impact technologies would make a lot of sense.